As thousands gathered outside, tears flowing and candles flickering in the Memphis heat, she stood silently beside the open casket, her eyes locked on the face of the man she once loved, the father of her only child. In that still, sacred moment, away from the cameras and the noise, she leaned in and whispered something so personal, so unexpected, it's never been spoken aloud, until now. And what their daughter placed in his casket that day, it wasn't just a tribute, it was a message, one that may shatter your heart. Long after the glittering lights of the stage had dimmed and the final curtain had dropped, there remained a quiet, unshakable connection between two people whose lives had once been intertwined in a way the world could only dream about. Though their marriage had ended years earlier, Priscilla and Elvis Presley never truly separated in spirit. Their bond, marked by passion, heartache, and history, lingered like an unfinished song. They had shared more than vows. They had shared a life, a daughter, and a love story that defied simple definition. In the days leading up to the funeral, the air at Graceland was thick with sorrow, but for Priscilla, it was more than just public grief. Behind closed doors, shielded from the endless stream of fans and cameras, she was not a public figure attending a state of mourning. She was a woman confronting the sudden silence of a man who had once been her entire world. Their story had started in innocence and unraveled in complexity, but even in its end, it held weight. What she was about to face wasn't a headline moment. It was heartbreak, raw, quiet, and deeply personal. This wasn't the staged farewell of a global icon. It was something far more human, a soul-wrenching goodbye between two people who had once belonged to each other in the deepest sense. And as Priscilla approached that final moment, she wasn't thinking about legacy or legend. She was reaching back through years of memories, through whispered promises and unspoken regrets, preparing to say something she'd been carrying in her heart for far too long. Graceland was overflowing. Thousands had gathered from across the country, some weeping openly, others standing in solemn silence, hoping to get one last glimpse of the man whose voice had once filled their homes, their radios, and their hearts. The air buzzed with the low hum of grief, the occasional sob, the shuffle of feet lining the estate's walkways. But inside, beyond the gates and the crowd, past the heavy curtains and hushed corridors, a very different kind of farewell was unfolding, one that no camera would ever capture. Within the mansion's walls, Priscilla and young Lisa Marie moved quietly through the rooms that had once held laughter, music, and the warmth of family. The house, so familiar and yet now changed forever, seemed frozen in time. As they entered the space where he lay, the noise of the world outside faded into nothingness. It was no longer about fame or fans or the myth of a man. It was about a daughter, a mother, and the silence that stood between them and someone they had loved beyond words. In that quiet room, the emotional weight was almost unbearable. While crowds pressed against the gates, desperate to say goodbye, Priscilla and Lisa Marie stood in a moment suspended from reality. Just the three of them. No applause, no spotlight, only stillness. The hush of grief filled every corner like a thick fog, and in that sacred stillness, they knew this was their last chance to speak, to feel, to let go. What happened next in that room was never meant for the world, until now. Later that evening, when the crowds had thinned and the mansion fell into a heavy, respectful silence, Priscilla returned to the room that once held some of their most private memories. Elvis' private suite. It was a place where they had shared quiet mornings and late-night conversations, far from the flashing cameras and relentless public gaze. The walls still carried a trace of his presence, as if time itself had paused in reverence. She moved through the space slowly, almost reverently, taking in every detail, every piece of furniture that once framed the life they had lived together. Now it felt both hauntingly familiar and impossibly distant. When she finally stood before him, the moment took on a sacred weight. There was no one else, just her, the stillness, and the man who had once been her world. She leaned in gently, studying his face, and in a voice tender with emotion, she whispered words that would stay etched in her heart forever. "You look so peaceful, Satnan, so rested. I know you'll find happiness and all the answers there." It was a goodbye shaped by love, pain, and years of shared history. But even then, through the veil of grief, Priscilla reached for a flicker of light. With the faintest smile, she added, "Just don't cause any trouble at the pearly gates." It was a quiet, affectionate tease, one only she could make. That single sentence revealed so much. Her pain, yes, but also her deep understanding of who he was. Even in death, Elvis was larger than life in her mind, and she could picture him charming his way into the afterlife with that signature grin. It was the kind of moment that straddled heartbreak and humor, where sorrow made room for one last smile. And it told a story far more intimate than any headline ever could. As the evening deepened and the final hours of farewell drew near, a quiet voice broke the stillness. It was Lisa Marie, just a child, but already carrying the weight of a moment that would shape her forever. Standing close to the casket, her small hands clutched something tightly. She turned to the funeral director with a simple, heart-wrenching request. "Mr. Kendall, can I give this to my daddy?" It wasn't a grand gesture or a flashy offering. It was a thin, sterling silver bracelet, delicate, meaningful, and deeply personal. The bracelet, barely noticeable to most, was more than jewelry. It depicted a mother and child's clasped hands, an unspoken symbol of comfort, trust, and eternal connection. It was Lisa Marie's way of staying close to the man who would no longer be there to hold her hand. As she gently placed it on his wrist with her mother by her side, time seemed to pause. It was a gift that spoke of love beyond understanding, the kind only a daughter can carry for her father. Pure, fierce, and forever unbreakable. Watching her daughter say goodbye, Priscilla felt a new wave of emotion crash over her. Equal parts heartbreak and fierce protectiveness. She understood instantly what that bracelet meant and feared what might happen if it remained visible. With the soft, quiet decisiveness only a mother could possess, she pulled the funeral director aside. She didn't want the world to see this final token. She wanted it to stay just between them. And so, she asked that the bracelet be gently tucked under Elvis's sleeve, hidden from view, safe from curious eyes, and kept close to him where it belonged. It was one last act of care, not just for the man they'd lost, but for the little girl who had just given him her heart. Outside the gates of Graceland, the world stood still. From every corner of the country and far beyond, people had come in droves. They brought with them flowers, handwritten notes, and trembling voices, each one hoping for a moment to pay their respects. Many had never met him. Most only knew him through records and television screens, and yet they felt as if they were saying goodbye to someone they had loved their whole lives. The line stretched endlessly through the Memphis streets, and the air was thick with sorrow and disbelief. No amount of fame could have prepared anyone for the scale of this farewell. As the casket was opened and placed in the entrance hall of Graceland, the crowd was ushered in one by one. What followed was a wave of mourning, unlike anything the estate had ever seen. Grown men wept openly. Women collapsed in the arms of strangers. Some people reached out as if to touch the air near him, needing to feel just one more connection. There were whispers, prayers, and quiet sobs echoing through the house. A few lingered too long, unable to look away, unwilling to believe what they were seeing. It wasn't just grief. It was the world reckoning with the end of an era. Even in his final days, when the spotlight had dimmed and critics questioned his future, the outpouring of love made one thing unmistakably clear. He was still their hero. He was still the voice that had carried them through heartbreaks and dreams. The energy outside the mansion wasn't about a fallen star. It was about a man who had given everything and still held a place in the hearts of millions. Fame fades, but reverence like this doesn't come from record sales or sold-out shows. It comes from something far deeper, something that lives in memory, in music, and in the silent tear tracks left on the faces of those who stood in that long, unending line. From a quiet room tucked away in the heart of Graceland, Priscilla watched as the line of mourners never seemed to end. It was her grandmother's room, a place of warmth and stillness amid the chaos outside. Through the window, she could see the slow, solemn procession of strangers stepping forward one by one, all there for the same reason, to say goodbye. Some clutched photographs, others held trembling hands to their hearts. And in the hush of that space, surrounded by the familiar scent of aged wood and memories, Priscilla allowed herself a moment to just observe, to truly feel the magnitude of it all. Each passing face told a story. These weren't just fans, they were people whose lives had been shaped by his voice, his presence, his existence. As she sat quietly, taking it all in, the weight of the moment pressed against her chest. There was no denying it, no matter how their story had twisted and turned over the years. He was loved, not just by her or by their daughter, but by millions. He was truly loved, admired, and respected, she thought to herself, the truth of it settling over her like a soft, heavy blanket. It was a realization both comforting and painful, proof of the life he had lived and the legacy he was leaving behind. But even as the world poured out its grief, Priscilla's own sorrow ran deeper, sharper, and more intimate. For her, this wasn't just the end of an icon, it was the end of a chapter no one else could fully understand. As she sat alone in that familiar room, her eyes fixed on the stream of mourners, a quiet truth surfaced inside her. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it cut through everything else. I knew my life would never be the same. There was no turning back. Something permanent had shifted, and the world that once held his presence would never quite feel whole again. In the quiet of that final moment, with the weight of the day pressing against her chest, Priscilla leaned in once more. This time, not as a public figure, not as someone playing a role in a grand farewell, but simply as a woman saying goodbye to the man who had once held her entire heart. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear, intimate, and meant only for him. "You look so peaceful, Satnin, so rested. I know you'll find happiness and all the answers there." There was no spectacle, no rehearsed speech, just the raw, unfiltered expression of love that still lived quietly between them, even in the stillness of death. In those few words, she let decades of memory flood through. Early days of laughter, the bittersweet stretch of years between them, the tender moments that never made headlines. And then, as if she knew he wouldn't want to leave on too somber a note, she softened the moment with a quiet smile and a final jest only he would truly understand. "Just don't cause any trouble at the pearly gates." It was a moment of levity wrapped in heartache, a gentle nudge to the man who never stopped being larger than life, even now. This wasn't just a goodbye, it was the closing of a chapter that spanned love, legacy, and shared history. And as she stepped back from his side, the silence spoke louder than words ever could. In that space between the living and the remembered, Priscilla's final words became more than a farewell. They became a tribute, a whispered truth echoing through time, carrying the weight of a love that had changed her forever. In the end, it wasn't the gold records or sold-out arenas that defined him. It was the quiet way he lingered in the hearts of those who truly knew him. Behind the glittering fame and larger-than-life persona was a man who loved deeply, laughed easily, and carried the same hopes and flaws as the rest of us. For Priscilla, for Lisa Marie, and for those who stood closest to him, the loss wasn't just of a legend. It was of a father, a partner, a soul that once filled a room with warmth long before the music began. His legacy, though echoed in stadiums, lives most honestly in these tender, human moments. As we remember that final goodbye, we invite you to reflect too. What did he mean to you? Was it a song that helped you through a hard time? A film that lit up your childhood? Or simply the sense that he was always somehow there, part of your world? Share your stories in the comments below. Your memories, like theirs, help keep him alive in ways that matter most. Not in headlines, but in hearts. If this story touched you, if it stirred something real, there's more to uncover, more moments, more memories that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel, and together we'll keep these stories breathing. Because some goodbyes are too powerful to be forgotten.